is time to talk about the Goodreads Choice Awards. So every year, Goodreads has nominees in a bunch of different genres for books that they think should win Book of the Year, and then it is voted on by members of the community. So this year, I decided that I wanted to try to read all of the nominees for the Goodreads Choice Award in the fantasy category to see if we really got it right. So Goodreads has been criticized in the past for this being essentially a popularity contest, since obviously you don't have to have read all of them to vote on a book, so it ends up being the ones that are most read tend to be the ones most voted for, or the ones by like really well-known authors and things like that, not necessarily the best. And so there's been a ton of criticism for that before, so I decided, what if I did read all 10 of them? So here was the structure of the Goodreads Choice nomination process this year. So Goodreads announced the first, I think it was 15 books that they were nominating for the Goodreads Choice Awards, and we as a community had, I think, a week or two to kind of vote on those and enter in any write-in votes that we thought should be in each category. Then after all of those votes were tallied, it was the 10 original books plus the 5 from the write-in category. So at this point there are 20 books available to vote on, and the community votes, and Goodreads takes the top 10 after that period of voting ended and made them finalists. So the finalists were announced on, I think it was November 17th, and you had until the 30th to vote on them. So my goal for this video was to read all 10 of the books that were nominated in that finalist category. So I started working on this at the beginning of November, before the finalists were even announced, but after the original list. So the way I went about this, I went through and found the ones that were read the most and had been rated the most on Goodreads, since they had the best chance of making it into that final round. So I started there and then slowly worked my way down to some of the less popular ones, or some of the ones that weren't as surefire of a bet going to make it into that final round. And then when November 17th came around and the finalists were announced, that was the final list that I was going to finish working my way through. But since it was the fantasy category, a lot of them were in series. So what I did was, if it was a series that I had not really read yet before, or if it was a later entry into a series, all I had to do to qualify for this video was read the first book. So for example, Empire of Gold by S.A. Chakraborty was nominated, but I hadn't started the Daevabad trilogy, so for the purposes of this, all I had to do was read City of Brass. So that was kind of my game plan going in. So the first book I read was Crescent City, or House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas. So I started with this book because it had the most ratings by far of any of the other ones in the category, so I had a good feeling it would probably make it into the finals. So this story is about our main character Bryce, who has some friends that are murdered by kind of mysterious means, and she gets brought in a couple years later on the investigation. And to be honest, I didn't have a huge amount of expectations going into this book. I'd read the Court of Thorns and Roses trilogy before, but that's all I've read of Sarah J. Maas, and I've heard that this was getting kind of mixed reviews, so I wasn't really sure what I was getting into. So as I was reading this, I found myself very torn. On one hand, I felt like the world was kind of interesting. I do enjoy a fast-paced urban fantasy, but on the other hand, I felt frequently that I just didn't care. I often felt like I wasn't a big fan of really any of the characters. I didn't really buy the chemistry between the main two characters, the main romance for a lot of it. I wasn't super interested, but at the same time, I wasn't able to put this book down. I don't know what it is about Sarah J. Maas's writing that literally makes it so I just tear through a book, but this one was no exception. I felt like I was able to read so much of this in one sitting, and I enjoyed what I was reading, but at the same time I kind of didn't care. Like, I wanted to know what happened next in the plot, but I didn't really care about any of the characters, which is really strange for me. I thought the world was interesting but a little bit underdeveloped. I thought the factions that were at play were very interesting, and I liked the way that that was all set up, but I felt like I didn't understand the lore of the world super well, or it wasn't explained in a way that I enjoyed. And I know I've only read the one series by Sarah J. Maas, but I did kind of feel like the main characters read pretty much like characters from the other series. There wasn't a whole lot of depth or dimensions to them that I really felt like I found. But again, I had a lot of fun reading this and I tore through it. So overall, I ended up giving it a 3.5 stars. I liked it. It was a decent start to the video. So after that, I read The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. So this was a book that everyone was talking about and a lot of people were really loving, even though it had only been out for like a little less than a month when I picked it up. So The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue is about a woman named Addie LaRue who made a deal with the devil to kind of experience her freedom and to live life the way that she wanted, and in doing so, she was granted immortality, but at the cost that nobody will remember her. So as soon as she finishes talking to someone or turns around or breaks their line of sight, basically, she is forgotten. This follows Addie throughout history, from when she made the deal to growing up all throughout her 300 years to the present day, where she meets a boy who remembers her name. So this book I really loved. The writing was beautiful and lyrical. It read like poetry in some places. In some places I think there were poems. I thought the concept was like hauntingly beautiful and I truly enjoyed it. The characters were very interesting and well developed and I liked that a lot. It really is just this hauntingly beautiful tale about what it means to leave your mark on the world and what it means to love people and experience those kinds of things, and it's a really beautiful book. I did give it 5 stars. And just when I thought I had found my favorite book of this video, I then read House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune. So House in the Cerulean Sea is about a middle-aged man named Arthur who works at an agency to protect magical children. So he goes and he inspects orphanages for magical children and makes sure that they are fit to house those kids. And he's essentially a corporate drone, just kind of living day in, day out and not really feeling much of anything, until he's asked to go on a particularly unique assignment to the house in the Cerulean Sea. While he's there, he meets these whole hosts of children who are potentially deemed as dangerous and the caretaker there. And it is a beautiful story. The writing was really interesting. It wasn't very lyrical, it was very simple, but it was very funny and I really thought it was engaging and I loved it. I cared about all of the characters so much. I thought they were so well written and it was just beautiful to read about them. There was a romance element in here that I really bought into wholeheartedly. I thought it was so sweet and beautiful and it was really believable too, and I really liked watching Arthur's progression from this kind of unfeeling corporate drone back into the person that he was and wants to be again. I thought it was a beautiful, heartwarming story about found family and love and what it means to kind of be alive and experience things. I also thought it was really interesting to tell that story through this fantastical lens where some of the children are basically baby dragons or gnomes or the Antichrist and things like that. I thought it was a unique way to tell this story. It was absolutely beautiful. It's, in my opinion, kind of a must-read for a lot of people. It was one of my favorites of pretty much all time. I loved this book so much. So the next book I read before the finalists were actually announced was Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. So Piranesi is a fantasy book about this man who is referred to as Piranesi, who lives in this kind of endless maze-like house that's got a very like Greek myth feel to it. And there's only one other person in this house. It is Piranesi and the other. And it's told in these journal entries that Piranesi is keeping, and at first it's just kind of about his daily life, but eventually Piranesi starts to understand that maybe something more complicated and sinister is kind of going on. This book is very short. I believe it's under 300 pages, but it accomplished what it set out to do. It was kind of a haunting tale. It was unsettling at times, but it was very atmospheric. I felt like I really understood the surroundings and I got a very clear picture of what this house and this maze sort of looked like, and I felt the story and the plot unfold and was kind of able to see how Piranesi had been misled and understand that mystery unfolding in real time, and I really enjoyed it. I didn't feel a deep connection with really Piranesi or any of the other characters that were involved, partially because I don't think you really needed to, right? It was told in journal entries, so I think it accomplished what it wanted to accomplish. It gave me that haunting feeling. It told its message about ambition and greed and all of that, but I didn't feel this strong connection to the characters. So overall, I think I ended up giving this book 4 stars. I thought it was really great, and if this kind of book sounds interesting, this shorter, more atmospheric, theme-driven sort of book, I recommend that you check this one out. So then we get to my first series book. So the book that was actually nominated this year is Peace Talks by Jim Butcher, which I believe is book 16 in the Dresden Files. So if you're a regular viewer of my channel, you know that I've been reading the Dresden Files for about 6 or 7 months now, but I'm not quite up to book 16 yet. So I just decided I would go ahead and read the next Dresden Files book to kind of get a feel for where the series was going and kind of judge my opinion on that. I recognize that quality throughout series can vary drastically and that basing it on earlier books is not necessarily fair, but if I didn't do that, I was gonna have to read like 15 more books for this video, so that's what we're doing. So broadly speaking, the Dresden Files is an urban fantasy that follows a wizard for hire, Harry Dresden, who works with the Chicago PD and as a private investigator to solve supernatural crimes, or crimes that look like they might have some kind of supernatural origin. And this series starts off as a very like serialized detective noir style series, but then after a few books it expands to have a much broader scope in what it's trying to do and the story it's trying to tell. And I really love this series. So the one that I read was Changes, which is book 12, and a lot of people have determined that Changes much like the title, is kind of the turning point and the changing point for this series. So I felt like this was a decent one to judge kind of the post-changes section of the series. And I've gotta say, this book was outstanding. I felt like at this point, we're 12 books in, all of the characters are really well developed. I really enjoy reading about a lot of them. I might not like all of the characters, but I definitely understand their motivation and they're more complex. This book really tied in a lot of the stuff from really early on in the series and brought it back and kind of explained how it's affecting everything now. And this book really raised the stakes for everything that's been going on. So I really loved this, and if this is the trend that the Dresden Files is going to take after this book, I am so excited because I loved it. So I gave Changes 5 stars, and I have a sense that Peace Talks is probably amazing. The next thing I read was A Deadly Education by Naomi Novik, which is the first in a new series of hers. So this follows our main character Elle, who is attending a magic school known as the Scholomance. And at the Scholomance, it is not your typical magic school. It is not a Harry Potter-esque setting where there aren't really teachers or classes. It is more that all of the students are kind of left in a free-for-all and the school provides the materials that they need to learn with deadly stakes. There are monsters that kind of roam the halls and accidents do happen. It is a cutthroat school. And at graduation, the entire senior class has to basically escape the school with hordes of monsters following them. So we start off with our main character Elle being saved by a boy named Orion, and she says that he has saved her for I think the second time and therefore he must die to protect her reputation. This story was actually a lot of fun. I really enjoyed the character of Elle. I thought she was interesting and headstrong. I thought the world itself was really cool. While a lot of it wasn't super well explained, I thought it was a very interesting take on the magic school setting, and I also just generally love academy settings and fantasy books. That being said, I didn't find myself super attached to any of the characters outside of Elle. I was kind of just lukewarm on a lot of them, and I thought the plot was kind of interesting, but I didn't really care so much. This is another book similar to Crescent City where I feel like I enjoyed the overall vibe and I enjoyed reading the book, but I didn't really care that much. Like, I didn't have a lot invested in it, but I did definitely like it. And if you like academy settings, like magic schools and things like that, I definitely think this is worth checking out because I thought it had a really fun and unique take on that concept. The next book on the finalist list was Empire of Gold by S.A. Chakraborty. So I hadn't read any of the Daevabad trilogy before, so I just started off and read City of Brass. So City of Brass is about a con woman living in 14th century Cairo named Nari who accidentally summons a Jinn warrior and finds out that she may be involved in some court politics and may not be exactly who she thinks she is, and ends up getting taken to the City of Brass. This book was beautiful. I really loved the setting in this book. I thought the description of the City of Brass itself and all of the kind of Jinn aspects of the book were absolutely gorgeous and atmospheric, and I love a good political fantasy, and this had some intense political maneuvering in it, and I really loved it. It was a little bit difficult to keep track of at times, but I think that is more a reflection of where my mental state was, because there is a description in the front of the book of like each of the different families and clans and everything. I just had trouble keeping it straight when I was reading it, probably because of how busy I was. This book has received a ton of hype, and for good reason. I definitely see where this is coming from. This book also had kind of a love triangle in it, which I know is an immediate turnoff for a lot of people, but this was the first pseudo love triangle that I've read in a long time that I actually really enjoyed. If you like primarily political driven fantasies and you want a fantasy book that isn't set in your typical medieval Europe setting, I definitely think you should give this a try. I overall gave this one 4.5 stars, I think. Book number 8 that was nominated was Rhythm of War by Brandon Sanderson. So this is another book that was a later entry into a series that I hadn't read yet. So rather than reading the 4th book in the Stormlight Archive, I went ahead and read the first, so I read The Way of Kings. And I was not prepared. So I've read some Brandon Sanderson before, and I know there's a ton of hype surrounding him, but I had never read any of the Stormlight Archive yet, and it blew me away. It was incredible. I don't even know how to describe the plot of this one because I feel like I'm still not sure exactly what's going on. This was a 1,000-page epic fantasy on a massive scale. And in typical Brandon Sanderson style, he does not info dump, he does not explain things to you, he just chucks you in the middle of the action. So the book follows these 4 different perspectives who are all in different areas of the world of Roshar as they're kind of starting to figure out what's going on with themselves and discover that maybe history isn't what they thought it was, and that there may be a very large threat to the world as they know it, which is extremely vague, but I just read 1,000 pages about it and I don't know how to synopsize it better. All I can say is that if you love large-scale fantasy, read this book. Like, just do yourself a favor. This book reminds me of A Song of Ice and Fire in that it's got lots of perspectives, lots of different countries, factions, high politics, world-ending stakes, but I enjoyed it more, and a lot of that I think has to do with Brandon Sanderson's writing style was a lot more accessible to me, but also his character work is amazing. I felt like I really understood all of these characters and what drives them, and I felt very connected to them. They felt very human and very real, as opposed to, I know a lot of other high fantasy sometimes can struggle with that, making their characters grounded and feel like real world people when there's so much fantastic world-ending stuff going on around them. This book was amazing. I gave it 5 stars. So next I read The Once and Future Witches by Alex E. Harrow. So this was a book I didn't have a ton of expectations about going into it. I had heard the synopsis and I knew it was going to be released and I was excited for it, but I hadn't really heard many people talking about it. This book follows 3 sisters who are all slightly magically inclined who come from an abusive household. Now they've split up and they haven't really spoken to each other in 7 years, but a magical event kind of draws them all together again for the first time. The first half of this book I wasn't super into it. I was enjoying it, but I wasn't all about it. But then that second half happened and I was so into this story. I thought this book did what it wanted to do so well. There's real magic and there's real witches happening in this book, but to paraphrase a quote that the book used, it's really about the idea that women are labeled as witches when they want more than they should. So it's an extremely feminist tale about empowering women and kind of bringing that power back, and it was so amazing. It was also incredibly atmospheric. I really felt like I was in the town of New Salem with them. I felt the extremely witchy vibes, and this book made me want to put on a cape and go dance around under the moonlight and burn down the patriarchy, like so badly. I really loved all of the sisters. I thought they fit the kind of archetypes that they were supposed to very well while maintaining their own unique characters. I just thought this book was incredible, and the way it wove in like real life folklore and fairy tales was so good, and just oh, this book surprised me. I did not expect to like this book nearly as much as I did, but I gave it a full 5 stars. So the last book on the list is a book I read closer to when it came out. So I read it before November even started, and that is The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. So this book explores the idea of cities being alive. The idea is that once cities become big enough and have this sort of distinct cultural presence and personality, they are born. So they manifest into these avatars, these real people who represent them. And so The City We Became follows the birth of New York City. But something goes wrong and there's an eldritch force that's trying to stop New York City from being born, so instead it splits into its 5 separate boroughs who have to find each other and unite the city. This book was super weird, and it actually gave me very similar vibes to The Once and Future Witches, in that it told the story of empowering those who are typically disenfranchised and going against bigotry and hate in a very unique and fantastical lens, and I absolutely adored it. If you want the witchy vibe, read Once and Future Witches. If you want N.K. Jemisin's wild storytelling and this weird eldritch horror vibe set in New York City, go with The City We Became. Or better yet, read both. But that book was also amazing. I gave that 5 stars. So that was all 10 of the books. What book do I think should be the winner of the Goodreads Choice Awards? Drumroll please. The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. Probably. So I'm a little bit torn because The House in the Cerulean Sea was definitely my favorite of the 10 books that I read. I absolutely adored it. However, I also feel like The Way of Kings is an option, and I'm torn because I only read the first book, and the one that was nominated, of course, was several books later in the series. So I don't actually know how Rhythm of War stacks up. Another thing is to point out is how different these books are. They are both fantasy books, but they're drastically different. On one hand, you have this cute little almost contemporary with fantastical elements that are just accepted in the world, but it really feels like it's rooted in our world, and it's very small scale fantasy, and it really just tells this very human story. On the other hand, you have this high epic fantasy with multi-perspectives. They're just such drastically different books, and I think it comes down to what you want to evaluate the books on. So if you want to evaluate on the book I enjoyed the most, it's House in the Cerulean Sea. But if you want to take like a fantasy specific approach, it might be the Stormlight Archives because of its incredible world building, its amazing magic systems and things like that were much more detailed and fleshed out. But if we're just going by my personal enjoyment, I'm gonna say House in the Cerulean Sea. That being said, the winners were announced today, and I haven't actually looked at them. So I'm gonna do that real quick. If I had to guess, just before we look, I'm gonna say House of Earth and Blood or The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue won, just because of the sheer volume of readers each of those had and kind of the popularity of them. But let's see what it is. Let's find out. Yep, so the winner is House of Earth and Blood. Doesn't surprise me because of how many more readers it had, despite the fact that it was probably one of my least favorites that I read. And following it very, very closely was The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. Yeah, so I called that. But it does make me happy that House in the Cerulean Sea got third when it was tied for ratings for a lot of them, because again, it was my favorite. So did the Goodreads community get it right? No, but it didn't surprise me either. This was a really fun project, and I think I'd like to do it again for other awards, maybe some that are more voted on by actual voting committees and not just the amount of people who have read the books and some of the books that haven't even been published yet when they were originally nominated. The Goodreads Choice Awards overall is a mess, but we're not going to get into that today. But I did have a ton of fun with this video, and if you've read any of these books, please talk to me about them. But I think that's all I've got for you guys today. If you want to keep up with what I'm reading, I have a link to my Goodreads in the description below, but other than that, I'll see you guys next time.